In Python, let's look at working with a couple of different formats for numbers, including the floating point and the scientific notation. The scientific notation you've probably seen before. For example, if you were in your Excel spreadsheet and you've got a column with numbers in it and they're very large numbers and it won't fit in the entire column width, you'll see the scientific notation, so it might have an E somewhere in there. When you're looking at scientific notation, it's basically exponent power of 10. So if you have 1.0 e to the third, it's the same as 0.001 or 1 times 10 to the third. And basically all you're doing is, let's say if you have e to the third, you're moving the decimal place 3 places to the left. So that's going to give you 3 decimals after that decimal place. So floating points also have decimals, but the decimals can float or they can be anywhere in the number. The floating point literal uses a fraction. So if you call it a floating point literal, even if your number is 0, you would have 0.0. If it was 50, it would be 50.0, and so forth. So you can format your floating point numbers in Python. So for example, here, if I've got a variable, my average, and let's say my average is 89.34567, then it's going to print my average, and then after that colon, you'll have 2 decimal places. So it will give you the average with 2 decimal places. For the formatting, you can also just directly put a calculation here and format it as a floating point with 3 decimal places. So whatever the result of this would be, it would give it a number with 3 decimal places. You can also ask the user for input. So maybe if you are asking for a test grade to be entered, you can use the input statement. This one's not using any prompt such as please enter a test number or a test grade. But we'll just assume that's what they're doing, is whatever the user inputs, it will convert that into a floating point. Let's look at a couple of examples. In this example, you have an example of inputting that number, and it's prompted to the user to enter a distance in miles. So whatever the user enters will be converted to a floating point floating point format. So for example, here the output would be if the user entered 450, then it would add that 0 on 450. The same down here, the second person entered in 1800, it's going to put that decimal point there. So let's look at another example. This one is it's an example on energy to mass conversion. So I'm not going to worry too much about the formulas for those. But since it's to mass conversion, we'll take that as our example variable. So here we have 3 examples of variables. One is an integer, one is a floating point because it has that decimal place, and the other is scientific notation, so it's e to the 9th. We have our mass, which will be part of our calculations, and that's converted from the input to a floating variable. So you can see how those are used in a program. So it's important for you to understand the differences between the floating point and the scientific notation and how those can kind of work together.